In this video, we're going to be going over the thyroid gland, which is extremely important for normal physiological functions of the body. And we're going to see there's a lot of clinical applications if the thyroid gland is not doing what the thyroid gland is supposed to do. Here's a thyroid gland, and it's just below your larynx. Well, the larynx, as indicated in the diagram, this is the larynx. And then the part of the larynx that you're looking at right here is called the thyroid cartilage. And this little notch is a thyroid notch. And you can palpate this on your own throat, your own larynx. Just reach out there and you can find this little notch. And then if you come down a little further, you'll find space here. And then you'll find another piece of cartilage. This is called the cricoid cartilage. And then just below that is the thyroid gland. In fact, you're going to find this isthmus of the thyroid gland here that's connecting the two lobes. Well, it's difficult to feel the thyroid gland because it's squishy, and you're not going to feel structure of the thyroid gland unless, of course, it's hypertrophy. What I want you to note is that behind the thyroid gland, posterior side of the thyroid gland, are these parathyroid glands. And the parathyroid glands have their own function. They're going to be heavily involved in calcium regulation. They're embedded in the thyroid gland, but they're considered to be separate glands. They're not part of the thyroid gland in its function. And looking at the functions of the thyroid gland, you want to make sure you star this. Thyroid gland produces hormones that control the rates of metabolic processes throughout the body. And this includes your basal metabolic rate, or your BMR. The thyroid gland is heavily involved in protein synthesis and calcium balance. We're going to see that the thyroid gland, along with the parathyroid glands that are embedded in the posterior part of that thyroid gland, they're involved in regulating how much calcium you have in the blood and keeping it in homeostasis. Thyroid gland is also very important in the growth and the development of the body. As I said earlier, the thyroid gland is inferior to the larynx, and it consists of two lateral lobes connected by a narrow isthmus. And remember, this is the isthmus right here that's connecting the two lateral lobes. And if you look at what isthmus means, this just means a narrow stretch of land that connects two larger bodies with water on each side. And so the isthmus of the thyroid looks like, well, a narrow stretch of land connecting two lateral lobes of the thyroid gland, hence its name, isthmus. Now, if you did a section through the thyroid gland and looked at it histologically, what you're going to see is that there are these thyroid follicles all through the thyroid gland. And they're lined by follicular cells, and these follicular cells produce the thyroid hormones, the thyroxine, or T4, and triiodothyronine, or T3. That's produced by these cells, and it's stored in here in what we call the colloid. It's just a glycoprotein. We're going to see that that has important functions in producing thyroid hormones. Then beside the thyroid follicle, you have another cell type, and these are called parafollicular cells. Now, para means to the side or beside. So these are beside the follicular cells that make up the follicle, and we call them parafollicular cells. Another term for this are C cells. And C cells produce a hormone called calcitonin. And you might be thinking, I can relate C cells to calcitonin as a hormone they produce. And you would be correct. That would be a good way of doing this. But the C doesn't stand for calcitonin. It actually stands for clear in the way that they appear after the thyroid gland's been stained. But putting calcitonin with C is helpful in remembering that the C cells, or parafollicular cells, make calcitonin. And calcitonin, we're going to see, is very important in lowering blood calcium levels if they get too high. So it's important in the regulation of calcium levels. Well, iodine is absolutely essential for making thyroid hormones. If you don't have enough iodine, you're not going to make thyroid hormones. Here's a histological slide showing the thyroid gland. And you can see these are called follicular cells that form the wall of the follicle. And then inside of this is your colloid. Well, this particular slide, when they prepped it, the colloid retracted. And so what you see here in purple is the colloid, but then there's this white area around it. That's where it's retracted from the follicular cells that make up the wall of the thyroid follicle. Then just beside these are your C cells. Remember, another term for C cells is parafollicular cells. But why do we call them C? Because they look clear after it's been stained. Compared to your follicular cells, which look a lot darker, the C cells are clear. And that's why they call them C cells, is for clear. And they produce what hormone? Calcitonin. So we can associate calcitonin with the C, but the C's actually just means clear in the way that they're stained. As I said, thyroid hormones, your thyroxine or T4, your triiodothyronine or T3, absolutely require iodine to be made. And so here is iodine being added to an amino acid called tyrosine, and the amino acid tyrosine is used to make thyroid hormones. And along with iodine, you make your thyroid hormones. Well, T4 or thyroxine has 4 iodine atoms attached, hence the name T4. T3 or triiodothyronine has 3 iodines attached, and that's the difference between T3 and T4. When we talk about iodine, I'm saying iodine atoms are attached. You can also refer these to iodide because the iodide is the ion, and iodide ions are attached to make these thyroid hormones. So you can refer to as iodide ions or iodine atoms attached to the thyroid hormone. How does the follicular cells go about making thyroid hormones? Shown here in this diagram is a follicular cell. And over here, you can see this is the follicle, this is the colloid, and the cells that line this are your follicular cells. That's this cell here. Iodide ions are coming into the follicular cells, and then they go into the colloid. Well, how exactly do you make the thyroid hormones? Here's the nucleus of this follicular cell. And through transcription and translation, you're going to make a protein called thyroglobulin, and that thyroglobulin has lots of the amino acid tyrosine. This thyroglobulin gets exocytosed into the colloid of the follicle, and that's shown right here. In this diagram, it's shown here. Here are your follicular cells, exocytosing thyroglobulin with lots of tyrosine attached into the colloid. Now, what happens in the colloid? In the colloid, you have an enzyme called thyroperoxidase. And what it does is it attaches iodine to the amino acid tyrosine within that thyroglobulin protein. Well, if it attaches 2 iodines to a tyrosine, we call it a DIT, or a diiodotyrosine. And if it attaches 1 iodine to a tyrosine, we call it a MIT, or monoiodotyrosine, because it only has 1 iodide attached. And through another enzymatic reaction, you have the tyrosines being attached to each other. Well, if you attach 2 DITs to each other, 2 diiodotyrosines to each other, you get a T4, and that's what you see right here. If you attach a MIT, monoiodotyrosine, to a DIT, you get T3. This is happening in the colloid. And now you have your thyroglobulin with your 2 DITs attached, a DIT and a MIT attached, and all of this thyroglobulin in here with all of these future thyroid hormones. Then you need to release thyroid hormones. So then a hormone from your anterior pituitary gland, known as what? That's going to come down and stimulate the thyroid gland to make and release thyroid hormones. What is that hormone called coming from your anterior pituitary gland? It's thyroid stimulating hormone. It's going to come down and it's going to stimulate these follicular cells to endocytose that thyroglobulin, and then enzymes are going to break apart the thyroglobulin so you get your thyroxine and your triiodothyronine. And that's going to be released into your blood to have its effect on other cells. It's a fantastic process. Thyroid hormones include thyroxine and triiodothyronine. Another name for thyroxine is tetraiodothyronine because it has 4 iodine atoms attached. And T4 is usually considered to be as the prohormone because that's the one that's generally inactive. And most of it's going to be converted to T3 in the tissue cells. Triiodothyronine, or T3, this consists of 3 iodine atoms and is the more active form. You want to make sure you star that. T3 is the more active form. So as a recap, upon stimulation by TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, the follicular cells are going to take up a portion of the colloid by endocytosis, remove the protein thyroglobulin from the T3 and T4, and secrete these free hormones into the blood. You want to make sure you star this. The thyroid gland normally produces about 90% T4 and 10% T3. But remember, what's the more active form? It's T3. So most of that T4 is going to be converted over to T3 in the tissue cells. Well, once released into the circulation, Most of the T3 and T4 are transporter bound to proteins such as thyroxine binding globulins or albumins. The rest is unbound or in their free form. Now, this bound form serves as a reservoir while the unbound form can move into cells. And in the tissues, most of your T4 is converted to T3, which is a more active form and acts on the target cell. So you have this bound form on the albumins or thyroxine binding globulin. So then as you're using the free T3 and T4 into the cells, the bound T3 and T4 can be released and act as a reservoir to keep supplying more T3 and T4. It's not an endless supply. I mean, you've got to continue to make it and release it from the follicular cells. So let's test your knowledge. Pause the video and select the term that makes a sentence correct. Here are the answers. Part 2. Pause your video and select the term that makes a sentence correct. Here are the answers. Part 3. Pause your video and select the term that makes a sentence correct. Here are the answers. And this concludes the video, and let me know if you have any questions. In the next video, we're going to be going over blood calcium regulation.